The last time I saw him was in San Francisco, so it's like the old song, I Left My Heart in San Francisco by Tony Bennett. I think about that every time I hear that song because the last time I saw Elvis alive, he was playing the Cow Palace.
She stood in the middle of the living room, remote in hand, the screen flickering to life. Linda Thompson had no idea what was about to hit her. The broadcast was supposed to be just another concert special. Elvis in Concert, 1977. But as the music began and the camera panned in on the man she'd once held so close, something inside her froze. Her eyes locked onto the screen, her breath caught. And in that moment, time stopped. She wasn't watching a performance. She was watching a man unravel. The face was familiar, but barely. Puffy, pale, and tired. His movements were slow, like every gesture took twice the effort it used to. His eyes, they weren't alive anymore. Linda remembered those eyes full of mischief and warmth, and now they were empty, disconnected, a shell. It was devastating to see him like that, she whispered later, voice trembling. And if you've ever watched someone you love fade in front of you, you know exactly what she meant. This wasn't the Elvis the world remembered. It wasn't the king in the white jumpsuit, dazzling millions with every move. This was someone else entirely. Someone lost. Someone broken. And yet, them's cameras rolled. The crowd cheered. The machine kept moving. That moment in 1977 wasn't just a heartbreak for Linda. It was a reckoning, a moment when the legend and the man violently collided. And for her, watching from a distance, it was the first time she realized just how far gone he really was. This video isn't just about a final performance, it's about everything behind it. The pain, the pressure, the impossible expectations, and the woman who stood by him as long as she could, until she couldn't anymore. Because when fame turns into a prison and love turns into survival, the spotlight doesn't just reveal, it shatters. And what Linda saw on that screen would haunt her for the rest of her life. Before the spotlight grew too hot, before the pills, before the sadness crept into every note, there was a man. And Linda Thompson didn't fall in love with the king. She fell in love with Elvis Presley, the man behind the myth, the one who made her laugh at 2 a.m., who reached for her hand in quiet moments, who held his fame like it was both a gift and a curse. They met in 1972, and from the start, there was something deeply human about him. Yes, he was larger than life, but when he was with Linda, he didn't try to be. He could just be Elvis, unfiltered, open, raw. He'd talk about his mother, his fears, his dreams. He didn't need to put on a show with her, and that's what made it real. There were nights they'd stay up until sunrise just talking. No crowds, no managers. He was thoughtful in ways the public never saw. He'd leave handwritten notes under her pillow. He'd recite poetry late at night, not because he wanted to impress her, but because he truly felt things that deeply. There was a tenderness to him, a sweetness most people never got close enough to witness. But even back then, cracks were starting to show. The fame had been following him like a shadow since he was a teenager, and as much as he loved performing, it was clear something in him was getting tired. Linda saw it, in the way he'd sometimes sit in silence for hours, in the way he'd retreat inward after a show, even when thousands had just cheered his name. Still, during those early years, there was so much light. He could light up a room with a joke, break tension with a grin. His charisma was magnetic, but it wasn't just for the cameras. It was in the way he treated people, the way he hugged his staff, the way he made Linda feel like she was the only person in the world when he looked at her. People think of Elvis as a performer, a legend, an icon. But Linda saw a man who struggled with sleep, who was plagued by insecurity, who carried the weight of millions of expectations on his shoulders. A man who desperately wanted to be understood, not just adored. And maybe that's what bonded them so closely. She saw through it all. The layers of fame, the flashy outfits, the public image. She loved the man who cried when he talked about his mother, who feared loneliness more than anything, who gave so much of himself to the world, he didn't leave much behind for himself. Those years from 1972 to 1975 were full of love, but they were also laced with warning signs, small moments that hinted at the storm ahead. Linda knew something wasn't right, but she also knew that when he smiled at her, when he took her hand, when he leaned his head on her shoulder after a long day, he was still in there, still trying. This wasn't a rock star crashing. This was a man slipping under the weight of something he couldn't quite name. And in those moments when the world wasn't watching, Linda held on as tightly as she could. Not to Elvis Presley, but to the man she loved. Because before the fall, before everything changed, he was still hers, still fighting, still reaching for something real. By the mid-70s, the cracks had become too big to hide. On stage, Elvis still looked like the icon the world worshipped, but behind the scenes, he was slowly disappearing. Linda watched it happen in real time, and no matter how hard she tried to pull him back, he kept slipping further into the image the world demanded of him. The burden of being Elvis Presley wasn't just about fame. It was about never being allowed to stop. Fans didn't want a tired Elvis, or a quiet Elvis, or a struggling Elvis. They wanted the myth, the king. 400 shows in 3 years. Constant touring, city after city, night after night. No time to breathe, no room to rest. His body begged him to stop. His heart, his mind, exhausted. But the machine didn't slow down. And Elvis? He didn't know how to say no. It wasn't just physical. The emotional toll was staggering. Linda saw it up close. The pressure, the anxiety, the fear that if he stopped, it would all vanish. He wasn't just performing for the crowd. He was performing for the legacy, for the empire, for the memory of who people wanted him to be. And somewhere in the middle of all that came the pills. They didn't start as a crutch. At first, they were just to help him sleep, to keep up with the schedule, to deal with the constant pain in his body. But slowly, they became the only way to survive the day. Then the only way to function. Then the only way to feel anything at all. Linda tried to help. She begged him to slow down, to see doctors, to take a break. But Elvis wasn't just tired. He was trapped. Trapped in the role, the legend, the business. Trapped in a life that no longer belonged to him. And then came the health problems. Real, serious ones. High blood pressure, liver damage, glaucoma, an enlarged colon that caused chronic pain. Every year, he got sicker. He gained weight, his face bloated, his hands trembled. And yet, he still put on the suit, still walked out on stage, still smiled, because that's what Elvis Presley was supposed to do. Linda watched all of it. The man she loved was fading, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She held his hand, she listened, she stayed, but she was breaking too. People talk about heartbreak like it's some dramatic movie moment. But sometimes, it's quieter. It's watching someone disappear slowly. It's waking up next to a person you love and realizing they're not really there anymore. By Christmas 1976, Linda couldn't do it anymore. It wasn't because she stopped loving him. It was because she still did. She knew if she stayed, it would destroy her too. The chaos, the late nights, the pills, the spiraling. She had given everything she could, and it wasn't enough to save him. And so, with tears in her eyes and her heart in pieces, she walked away. Not out of anger, not out of blame, but out of self-preservation. She left behind the man she loved because she couldn't bear to watch him vanish in front of her. And still, even then, she held on to hope. Maybe he'd turn things around. Maybe he'd rest. Maybe he'd remember who he was underneath it all. These were the last shows ever filmed of Elvis Presley. Not the ones you'd expect from a man hailed as the greatest performer of a generation. These were raw, unsettling, painful to watch. And they were filmed for millions to see. The idea came from Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's longtime manager. He wanted one more televised special, one last cash grab, one more chance to parade Elvis in front of the world. He framed it as a tribute, but those who really knew Elvis saw it for what it was, a man in no shape to perform, being pushed to keep pretending. The moment the cameras started rolling, it became clear. This wasn't a concert. It was a cry for help. Elvis looked nothing like the man who changed music forever. His face was bloated. His speech was slurred at times. He seemed disoriented, almost distant from the world around him. The jumpsuit that once sparkled now hung awkwardly on his heavier frame, and the energy that once electrified stadiums was reduced to a slow, haunted sway. And yet, somehow, he kept singing. Linda wasn't there. She wasn't backstage. She wasn't in the crowd. But weeks later, when the footage finally aired, she sat down in front of the TV and braced herself. And still, nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. It was horrifying to me, she later said, devastating. Because the man on that screen wasn't just sick, he was gone. The spark that made him Elvis, gone. The strength in his voice, flickering. The charisma that once made entire arenas fall silent, replaced with pain and fatigue. And the worst part? It was all public. The world watched as Elvis Presley struggled to stay upright on stage. They watched him try to smile, try to move, try to remember the words. And through it all, the audience clapped like everything was fine. But it wasn't. It was far from fine. Jerry Schilling, one of Elvis's closest friends, was outraged. How could you let him be filmed like that, he asked. And he wasn't alone. Many of those closest to Elvis felt the same way. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a betrayal. Because this wasn't just about image, it was about dignity. And yet, the special aired anyway. On October 3, 1977, less than 2 months after Elvis died. The timing made it feel even worse. The world was still mourning, and now they were being shown footage of a man who clearly shouldn't have been performing, a man who needed rest, not a spotlight. The Presley estate later refused to release the footage commercially. They said it didn't represent the Elvis they wanted the world to remember, and maybe that's fair. But for those who knew him, really knew him, that footage became something else entirely. A haunting reminder of just how far things had gone, because it's one thing to hear about decline. Linda didn't cry right away. She sat there, stunned, silent, like someone had punched the air out of her lungs. And when she finally spoke, it wasn't dramatic. It was just heartbreak. That performance was more than a concert. It was a mirror, and what it reflected wasn't just about Elvis. It was about all the people who loved him, who couldn't stop the spiral, who had to stand by and watch as the man they knew disappeared. Elvis in concert wasn't meant to be a tragedy, but that's exactly what it became. A final chapter written in exhaustion, broadcast in full color for everyone to see. The applause never stopped. The lights never dimmed. But something inside Elvis already had. And Linda, all she could do was sit there, eyes locked on the screen, and whisper the words that so many others were thinking. He never should have been up there. The concert was almost over. The room was quiet now, tired. The band was winding down, the crowd beginning to settle. And then Elvis sat down at the piano. No big announcement, no flashy intro, just him, alone with the keys. What came next? No one expected. He started to play Unchained Melody, a song he'd sung before, sure, but not like this. Not here, not now. His hands were shaking. His breath was uneven. His face, tired, swollen. But when he opened his mouth to sing, it was like something cracked wide open. The voice didn't come from his body. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that hadn't been touched by the years of pain, the drugs, the exhaustion. In that moment, it wasn't about control or polish. It was about emotion. Pure, unfiltered, gut-wrenching emotion. And it hit everyone like a wave. Tony Brown, his pianist, said later,
"That song brings him pain for some reason. I don't know why it does, but it was like the greatest performance he'd ever done."
And you can see it, hear it, feel it. Every line, every note was heavy with something unspeakable, like he was pouring everything he had left into that song. Linda would later say, "The power he had, it was just gut-wrenching." And she was right. It wasn't a perfect performance. His voice cracked, his fingers missed a few keys, but none of that mattered. Because in those 4 minutes, Elvis Presley reminded the world of who he really was. A soul, a man, an artist. This wasn't the polished superstar in his prime. This was someone who had been through hell, someone who had given everything to the world, and somehow still had something left to give. It wasn't just beautiful, it was haunting. There's something sacred about that kind of moment. A performance not for the cameras or the crowd, but for himself. For the little boy from Tupelo who loved gospel music. For the man who never felt like he truly belonged. For the artist who still had one last thing to say. And he said it. Unchained Melody wasn't just a song that night. It was a goodbye. A message wrapped in melody. A whisper from the heart of a man who didn't know how to quit, even when his body had already started shutting down. People still talk about it. Not because it was technically impressive, but because it was real, because it was brave, because it showed us that no matter how far gone he seemed, Elvis never stopped being Elvis. He was still in there, beneath the pain, the pressure, the silence, still fighting, still reaching, still singing,